Welcome everyone to a conversation between New Zionist Congress and the Summer Fellows of the Tikvah Fund. I'm so excited to be here with you all. My name is Isabella, and I'm currently on my gap year in Jerusalem on the Shalom Hartman Institute's Havruta Gap Year program, and will be starting at Stanford University next year. As an avid member of NZC's leadership team and a two-time participant in the Tikvah Fund summer program for high school students, I'm thrilled to be hosting this event as a collaboration with two organizations that have taught me to think analytically about Zionism and Jewish issues as they play out in history and the modern world. The New Zionist Congress is a new organization founded and managed by Jewish college students and young professionals. We seek to empower the next generation of Jewish leaders to take pride in Jewish self-determination and the safety of the Jewish people. If you'd like to participate in more events like this one, sign up to become a member of our organization at newzionists.org to receive our weekly newsletter. Today, we are joined by Maya Moritz, Kennedy Lee, and Daniel Gottesman. Over the summer, Maya, Kennedy, and Daniel participated in the Tikvah Fund's fellowship program, each given the opportunity to create a research project on the Jewish experience. The Tikvah Fund is a philanthropic foundation and ideas institution committed to supporting the intellectual, religious, and political leaders of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. They are also heavily invested in the Jewish education of young people, correctly seeing our generation as the next generation of leaders. Thank you so much for being here, all three of you. Why don't we start with Maya? Can you tell us a little bit about your project?
Yes, thank you for having me. So I was inspired by a class I took last semester here in Germany for my master's. And we looked at the interwar years between World War I and World War II. And that allowed me to draw this timeline between the Treaty of Versailles after World War I and then the reparations agreements following the Holocaust. And then after that, I started to see these articles in courts in the Atlantic about how we can use this model of compensation following World War II for Jews to other victimized groups like African Americans, victims of genocide or colonization. And the articles really took for granted that the model worked. They said, how do we apply this? But my question was more, should we apply this? Is this the correct way to go about distributing funds or helping these communities to move past all the financial difficulties they've been through, because it's very impossible to deal with the emotional turmoil that these events caused. So I interviewed children of survivors, people involved in the distribution process, basically all sides of the story, and really got this really nuanced picture of how maybe this isn't a model we want to implement. And the model we want to implement is one that's very different and very unique to each scenario. So very excited to discuss that.
Thanks so much, Maya. Now on to Kennedy. Tell us a little bit about your project.
Isabella, thank you so much for organizing, and Blake and New Zionist Congress for having us. It's so nice to be with Maya and Daniel today as well. So my project, I was actually thinking about this project for quite a few months before I even applied for the Tikvah Fellowship. So I come from a Christian background. I have been to Israel with Passages Israel. If some of you have heard, it's sort of like the Christian birthright, sorry. So basically, I was participating in sort of a leadership incubator project with Passages. And I was really fascinated with Christian Zionism in Europe, and the fact that no one really talked about Christians in Europe, and not that they just didn't talk about them, they just wrote them off. So I had seen the work that the Philos Project and Passages and other Christian Zionist organizations had done to really build bridges with between Jews and Christians in the United States, and between Christians and the state of Israel. And I wondered why no one was focusing about this, or no one cared about this in terms of Europe's Christians. So I was first of all thinking, is there sort of an organization that we could form to connect American and European Christians so that American Christians could sort of educate Europeans on this subject? Like, what could be done? Could it be a sort of trip program like Passages? And then after the 11-day round of skirmish in May, conflict, whatever you would like to call it, we saw that European countries were speaking out much more favorably on Israel's behalf and voting more favorably so at the UN or in EU Parliament, for example, than had ever happened during another round of fighting. And so that really became the focus of my project. And not only that, but most people would argue that this was solely for security or economic purposes. And there was no values-based argument to be had. But I really wanted to sort of look into Christians in these countries and see if there was a values-based push on their behalf to form closer relations between their nations and Israel and the Jewish people.
Amazing. Thanks so much. Daniel, can you tell us a little bit? Thank you so much, Kennedy. Daniel, can you tell us a little bit about your project?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Isabella, for all the work you did in the New Zionist Congress. Studying in college, I did both I was fascinated by the intersect of philosophy and history. And growing up in a Jewish home, the Holocaust always emerged both annually and throughout the year. And I was noticing this, I got introduced to this new trend of thought of Holocaust theology, from basically thinking about from a historical perspective of what the greater questions that come out of the Holocaust, what philosophical questions and quarrels come out of the Holocaust. And after reading a few books and looking into it a little bit, I realized there's a plethora of opinions and approaches, and what they really offer you is something that goes a little bit deeper than the straight facts of this happened and that happened, of the numbers and the stories of exactly what happened. And it takes a little bit of a human nature. It looks at the human nature question of it. How does the Holocaust speak to us nowadays? How can the Holocaust continue to speak to us for generations? And as time moves on and we move further and further away from the years where it happened, and as the generations move on, I believe that through this prism of theology of all things, we can possibly relate to the Holocaust in a different way, but albeit possibly in a different, deeper way.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I'm going to move on to the questions. My first question is for Maya. What were the events in Germany that led to the Shoah? What was the stab in the back myth, and why was it so successful? And what economic and social factors was the society facing at that time that made scapegoating the Jews so popular?
Yeah, so it's such a difficult question that can go back to the beginning of anti-Semitism. But what I really focused on was the World War I. So the stab in the back myth started in about 1918 after Germany lost in a really humiliating victory. And the idea is that Germany did not lose on the front lines as a result of poor tactical choices or arming decisions, but they were stabbed in the back from the inside of the country by Jews, revolutionary socialists, and others who brought about labor unrest and ensured that Germany would lose through all sorts of methods. And it was a right-wing conspiracy theory that became really popular alongside other world events. And this was that after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was decided. And so this was an unprecedented punishment for Germany's role in the First World War. So before this, historically, there was about a precedent of 20% of your GDP paid to the winning party. So this was in several treaties, but Germany was forced to pay 260%. And keep in mind, Germany was already falling apart economically, and we come into this transfer and creation problem where the other European powers were taking away Germany's means to meet the reparations payments while also demanding more and taking land. This was especially humiliating because Germany did not begin the First World War. It was a skirmish in another part of Europe. So Germany was incredibly humiliated in the worst economic situation in that part of the world. People were burning money for warmth as hyperinflation just got so out of control. Waiters would stand on tables and announce new prices, and you would buy your beers at the start of the night because they'd be double the price by the time you're ready for the next one. And so instead of blaming government ineptitude or the treaty itself, it was really easy to look at who was doing better in society. So Jews, or who had power. So for example, Jewish friends or acquaintances of world leaders, and blame them and say that they were not only part of extracting the reparations, but they brought about the fall of Germany, starting with the stab in the back myth. So a lot of things were coming together, and we see this time and time again when things begin to fall apart. It's easy to scapegoat, for example, with the bubonic plague, and the Jews were scapegoated then. So this was, it was just like this ball that kept growing and growing, and the stab in the back myth is only a symptom of latent anti-Semitism, compounded by a really poorly thought out treaty, which was made really clear by John Maynard Keynes at the time. And this is what really brought us to the rise of the Nazis, alongside several other factors, but this was a really important one.
Thanks so much. That was very interesting. I saw your graph about the inflation in Germany, and I don't quite remember what the numbers were. Do you remember what what percent the inflation was?
Yeah, so let me pull it up because it's so interesting. But essentially, the exchange rate of one Deutsche Mark for a US dollar was 4.2 marks per dollar throughout the beginnings of World War I. And then it began to rise slowly. And I believe it was in the year 1923 that it reached billions. You would have to exchange billions for one US dollar. So it was not even worth papering your walls with this money. It was worth nothing.
Thanks so much. Okay, the next question is for Kennedy. Is there a difference between how European countries viewed Israel during previous conflicts between Israel and Hamas and how they viewed Guardian of the Walls? If so, why did they react differently?
Yes, the short answer is yes. There is absolutely a difference if you look, for example, from 2014 with Operation Protective Edge into how European countries reacted this time around. So I was actually in Israel shortly after the skirmish ended in early June, and we met with some foreign policymakers within Israel, and things were really interesting, things that they said to me, which was very validating because the day I was coming back to the US, I was about to start the fellowship with Tikvah and start this research. But these people were saying this time around was so strange because the Europeans were much nicer to us, and it was actually the Americans who were speaking about us differently than they ever have before. And that is so interesting. And this is actually the main question of my research, right? Is why? Why is this going on? So some people will argue, a lot of transatlantic scholars, for instance, are arguing that this is, for purely economic or security reasons. I think something that is a main point in this that I don't talk much about in the research is the background of the Abraham Accords. I think when the European countries look out and they're trying to form their foreign policy and they see Israel and Muslim countries in the region forming friendly relations and such close ties, they feel that they can speak on this in a different way than they may have felt that they had to approach it with their domestic audience before, for example. And I think that with Abraham Accords really leading the way, you will just see more and more developments here. But also, I think that it goes back to sort of the heart of my research, which is the split between Western European countries and Eastern European countries. So basically right now, Central and Eastern European countries are really struggling to find their identity. They're looking at their Western European counterparts and thinking, we don't really want to follow this sort of secularization trend. There has to be another way, and really contemplating all options. And a lot of these leaders are finding it in sort of Judeo-Christian civilization and really looking to Israel. There's so much talk going on. For example, there's talk of Hungarian government wanting to form a sort of Judeo-Christian civilization center in Budapest. I don't know much about that. There's the thing with my research too is there's so many new developments. Like I check Twitter or the news every single day, and there's something new that is relevant to my research. But I think at the end of the day, this also goes back to more and more Christians are traveling to Israel from these countries, halted because of the pandemic, of course, than have before. So we'll get into this more later. But when I spoke to these Christian leaders for my research, their congregants now have experience in the land of Israel versus, the European Jewish experience. They have this example of a thriving Jewish country in the world. And when they look to that, I think it makes them think differently than they ever had before. So just in the 7 years since Operation Protective Edge in 2014, for example, they have had these on the ground experiences. So I think that is what I would say. There's a lot of factors, but I'm really working to get at what is the main one and what's really going on here.
Thank you so much. All right, now my next question is for Daniel. As you can see, we have kind of a theme here, a lot to deal with the Holocaust, a lot to deal with kind of Europeans' reactions about Israel and different Jewish issues. Daniel, my question for you is, how would teaching Holocaust theology differ from the standard way Holocaust education functions nowadays?
So I think what the question really touches on is how much do we assume is known and cared about from the average student in a day school or in any Jewish setting when they approach the Holocaust or when the teachers approach the Holocaust. And I think that in the contemporary standard, from what I've seen, both my own education and also from talking to different educators, is an innate awareness, a firsthand awareness or relation to a firsthand awareness of what happened in the Holocaust, of knowing survivors who saw the tragedies and being able to feel and really sense the tragedy of the destruction of European Jewry. And I think that as time moves on, so within that model, the current education seems to focus a lot on narrative of reading memoirs, Diary of Anne Frank, Elie Wiesel, and in addition to that, learning the bare history of the matter. How many people went here, numbers of towns destroyed, what dates they were moved from which camp to which camp. And I think that as time moves on, like I explained in my opening, as time moves on, the additional model would address the fact that as that generation, that firsthand narrative is being lost, unfortunately, by delving deeper into the big questions that emerged from the Holocaust, we could possibly allow it to essentially escape time and to keep it forever relevant. In that the questions that were raised from the Holocaust, I think, speak to every generation in different ways. And by focusing on the theology, we're able to see how immediately afterwards, a generation of great theologians asked some major questions about what to do with the Holocaust. And those questions touch on things that we as people and as Jews really face every day, usually after trauma, usually after some pain. However, I think that the ability to look at it from the theological perspective allows us to essentially dig deeper into its everlasting presence and shift away possibly from that firsthand narrative. Ultimately, the goal would be that it would bring us back to see the glory and the beauty in the rich Holocaust literature which we have. But one quick example of where I think you see this the most is I think that if you look at the literature, specifically from the theological perspective, a lot of it touches on verses and on homiletics that's described in the prophets from Isaiah and Jeremiah. I think that the lesson is this continuum that when the prophets wrote their response to tragedy, when they wrote and they put pen to paper on their response to destruction and tragedy, I think that these theologians were tapping into the deeper idea that as time goes on, tragedies touch at something which makes us human. And by connecting to that baseline of what makes us human, we're able to escape this prism of time of, did you happen to live within 60 to 70 years after the Holocaust? And even as we go further and further on from the 30s and the 40s and from European Jewry, I think that we'll be able to touch and to really feel what these theologians were talking about and connect in a deeper way to the horrors of the destruction of European Jewry.
Thanks so much. I completely agree. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and I know that, Holocaust survivors aren't going to be alive forever. There are only about a few 100,000 of them left in the world, and I completely resonate with the idea of making sure that this literature and this narrative lives on. So thank you. All right, so now my next question is for Maya. When Israel was reckoning with the subject of reparations, why was there even a debate? Why was it so contentious? And what were Menachem Begin's views on the matter?
Yeah, this is super interesting because I was really surprised to figure out there was ever a debate, because if somebody's offering me money for something horrible they did to me, of course, I should take it. But that was not the thought in that time for many, many people. It was a question of the future of the Jewish people and how we would see ourselves as self-image, because Menachem Begin really thought that accepting German reparations would be to work with the Nazis, to become a collaborator. And he said as much in very vitriolic speeches, some of which led to great fights and riots, which injured many, many people, some very severely. And I think in one of them, 200 demonstrators and 140 police officers were wounded. And that's when the tide really turned against him. But he was basically saying that the Jews can build themselves back up. They don't need the German money. And to take the German money is an insult, to say that we, not only are we so weak that the Holocaust happened to us, and now we'll take money from the very people who did it. We'll have to beg them for it. And that was unconscionable in his mind and the minds of thousands of his supporters. And it even became a biblical, theological debate. They called up different stories. So one of them brought up the story of the Amalekites and how King Saul, instead of killing them, not only spared them, but took their best livestock. And in revenge, Samuel the prophet killed the king of the Amalekites and took all the stock. And the idea was that we cannot take the German money, because then we will be letting the Amalekites taking them and basically forgiving them for something that's unforgivable, and believably so. And then on the other hand, there was another biblical story of Nevat the Jezreelite, and they were saying that King Ahab in the Bible murdered him and then kept his land. And by allowing the Germans to not pay Israel, they would be killing the Jews and keeping their land, which it was unconscionable for the other side. And then there was also, and as an economist, this is what I first thought of, it was this untenable economic situation in Israel. They just did not have the money to pay for fuel, and people were on 1,600 calorie a day diets, akin to what was in Britain during World War II. Shops were empty, and even people on the kibbutzim who were creating the food were not able to have eggs. So it was really a practical problem against a moral fight. And clearly, Menachem Begin did not win, and Ben-Gurion did in this fight. And then Israel really profited off this, and people were elevated in their standard of living to a very large degree, to a degree that even caused jealousy in Eastern Europe and in Israel, when survivors got a better quality of life and nicer apartments once they were able to claim money. But this was this horrible, really difficult, re-traumatizing process. So it's just so complicated and in a completely different context than anything we can think of today, when this conversation of would you accept reparations isn't happening so much. It has happened. For example, Namibia said to Germany recently that they would accept no amount of money for massacres that occurred during the period of colonization in the early 1900s. But among everybody I spoke to, except for a select few who were very much against it, they said that it's not even a question. Of course, reparations are great. Of course, we would take more. And of course, they helped Israel. So it's really grounded in the context of the time.
Thanks so much. Yes, I remember learning about this reparations debate in the Tikvah Scholars program, summer program, that in a Zionist class that I took. It was very, very interesting. Especially, I highly recommend listening to Menachem Begin's speeches on this and other topics. He's a very, very compelling speaker. Okay, my next question is for Kennedy. If more support for Israel is coming from right-wing leaders and governments, should that worry left-wing supporters of Israel, especially because Israel hopes to keep support in the United States a bipartisan issue? And what might religion have to do with all of this?
Yes, that's a really fantastic question. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in Europe is because I think that a lot of people on the left in the United States are also very interested in Europe, and especially the more progressive countries of Western or Northern Europe, for example. And I think if you see increasing sort of partnerships and relations between these countries of Europe and Israel, this may have an effect on sort of left-wing critics of of Israel in the United States. I actually think that this could even strengthen bipartisan support for Israel in the US. And I think that's why, supporters of Israel in the US should be very cognizant of this issue and very interested in it, actually, because if we can sort of ally shore and get our European allies on the same page as us on Israel, I think that's a fantastic thing. And with the issue of Israel becoming such a polarized partisan issue in the US, I actually think that this is maybe a track to depolarize it in a sense. So it's something that I think is very interesting. And I'll give you just a few examples. So in Germany, for example, I will also say that the purpose of my research was not to sort of be a puff piece for right-wing leaders in Europe. That is most definitely not the purpose, and actually quite to the contrary. I was trying to see, other instances of this really coming from the ground up and not from just this sort of strand of right-wing leadership in Europe today, especially in Eastern Europe. And in Germany, for example, the FDP, the Free Democratic Party, I hope that's what it's called, which is a liberal party in Germany. I think it's sort of like classically liberal, and it's actually in talks to join the new coalition following Angela Merkel's retirement. It actually has stronger pro-Israel stances than the right-wing parties in Germany's coalition, for example. In 2019, this FDP party actually presented a resolution in German parliament to condemn Germany's voting record on Israel at the UN. This resolution said something to the effect that, Germany is taking actively is always voting on the wrong side of these biased resolutions against Israel on the UN, and that Angela Merkel's government should be condemned for this. That is coming from her left in Germany. So that's a very interesting development. And then also, if you just look at the countries that boycotted Durban 4 in September, 38 countries total boycotted, 28 of which are from Europe. And a lot of those countries that boycotted in Europe have left-wing governments today. Denmark is one of them. Denmark and Austria together were the first countries to form a vaccine partnership with Israel and Netanyahu in March of this year. So I don't think that this is something that is solely coming from the right in Europe. And moreover, I think that we should obviously be cognizant of historical right-wing anti-Semitism in Europe, but we should also look for opportunities where opportunities are presenting themselves to build a broader coalition of pro-Israel sentiments, not only globally, but also here within the United States.
Thanks so much. And I didn't put this in the document, but I kind of want you to elaborate a little bit more on Christian Zionism and why these Eastern European countries who are Christians, you say, by value support Israel.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sorry, I forgot that part of your question.
No worries.
So really the bulk of my research was just randomly from the ground up emailing like Hungarian bishops and people with the Evangelical Church of Germany and the Bavaria Church, Lutheran Church, and all of these places to speak with Christians in Europe. And I think many of these Christians lament the way that their churches were complicit in the Holocaust. And they think that, this burden really lies on them in their countries for not speaking up in the mid-20th century, and that they must know, and that they must make sure that their congregants are aware of this, and that something like this never happens again, and that they are leading the way within their countries to build support for Israel, for example. So Christian Zionism within the US is something that is very widely talked about, is something that is usually spoken about as just US specific, for example, right? Like the Hebraic roots of the United States are what lead to this, and that, it could not be a global phenomenon. But I think if you look at Christian theology, you have to notice that, the first covenant still stands. And I think a lot of these Christians in Europe today believe in that theology. Actually, like the Protestant churches of Germany, I think this is in the 90s or early 2000s, have released multiple policy papers on stating, that they still believed in the first covenant, and all of these policy papers on the Jewish people. And this is a sort of strand of Christian Zionism that you would see in the United States, for example. So it's also manifesting itself there. Then I had one last thought, but I think I'll talk about this later.
Okay, I'd like to hear more about it, maybe in a later question. But yes, I think that in the Jewish community especially, there are a lot of misconceptions and controversies surrounding Christian attitudes about Zionism. So I'd like to hear more of that in a later question that I'll ask you. Okay, now back to Daniel. Could you speak to the differences amongst denominations regarding Holocaust theology, and if that would play a role?
So one of the reasons why I chose this topic for my project was because of the cross-denominational appeal that the Holocaust plagued all types of Jews from all denominations, and since then each subsect has dealt with it in its own way. So obviously, from an educational front, each community would teach in the fashion which they think is most productive, and also would teach the theology and would teach the material that they think would be productive. However, I think that amongst the denominations, I think that by now also there's been a lapse of time that the conservative, reformed, or orthodox thinkers have an appeal that I think could speak to different denominations. So, for instance, there's a number of reformed theologians who have very harsh things to say about the relationship between God and the Jewish people after experiencing the Holocaust. And I think that while it may not be Orthodox doctrine necessarily, I think that any Orthodox student can benefit, or could possibly benefit, from hearing the harshness of the tone. It's a very knee-jerk and strong reaction that many people find to learning of the horrors, and to see the horrors that were done and the tragedy that occurred, and to see in writing that someone wrote that, be it Richard Rubinstein or Irving Yitz Greenberg, who wrote of the breaking of the covenants, which is a feeling that each of us have, or to see and look now at the growth that the Jewish community has experienced, and the Orthodox thinkers that have spoken about the duality between the pain on the one hand, but the hope that emerges on the other hand. I think it speaks to any modern person who's looking at both the pain which we experienced and the glory with which now we're being showered and blessed with. And I think that this duality amongst the denominations, I think that one, Holocaust theology is broad enough that it can appeal to all denominations and all types of students. And I think on the other hand, we have the ability that since when the theologians wrote what they wrote, the human message which they dictated and the human message which they gave over is able to appeal cross-denominationally. And it addresses the major issues which, as I mentioned last time, I think even the prophets really addressed. And I think that it could speak to all different types of students, different ages, at different places, in religious level, on any sort of wherever they may be.
Thanks so much. And a little bit of a follow-up question. I think, I think that your project really can touch upon the deepest, most pressing questions in Judaism, and kind of ask, why does God let bad things happen to good people? Does everything happen for a reason? I think that these are questions that, personally, as a Jew that went to Jewish day school in 4th or 5th grade, we were asking these questions very, very early. And I think our teachers came up with differing responses to them and let us come up with our own responses. But how do you think that young children who are just starting to ask these questions and just starting to learn about the Holocaust and have very emotional reactions to this, the Jewish community, how would that play out in the classroom?
Yes, I think it's a great point, and I think that it touches on this duality. When I spoke to one of my mentors, who's a big name in Tikvah, Ruth Wise, about this, she had mentioned.
I love Ruth Wise.
She had mentioned that I was thinking in two clear boxes, And I think that going back to the original point I made between the difference between theology and narrative, I think that, when students have these questions, and by no means I'm not an educational expert, but when students have questions, wherever they may be, there's different responses which are elicited in narrative, in stories, in biographies, in autobiographies, in memoirs. And then there's the theological perspective, which tells you from the other perspective, not how it felt, but what could have been going on. So I think wherever the student may be, I think that that's probably the best way to answer it. But I think that, just to go back, I think that one of the things that you're seeing more and more of, I think that the way that the contemporary scene for both Holocaust theology and arguably also Holocaust literature is you see more of a plethora of opinions. You see more of a survey of opinions. So as opposed to in the 60s and the 70s, where a certain thinker would come out with their ideology and their theology on the matter, nowadays, I think that you see a survey of opinions. And I think that this really touches on the point that a student can open up a book and they can see the different opinions and the questions that they're having. They can see that this thinker may not answer what I was wondering, but that thinker might.
Thanks so much. All right, my next question is for Maya. What were the 3 distinctions in regard to form of compensation? What do they mean in a historical and contemporary context? Additionally, can you speak more about how reparations were distributed and how they impacted the economic development of Israel?
Yeah, so this is really important because I actually was scolded for using the word reparations by a person who said that they imply that you can repair the Holocaust, which you clearly cannot. And he uses the word compensations, but actually with a different interviewee, Dr. Aaron Moore, who wrote his PhD thesis on this topic, there's a clear set of defined terms for this. So the first is reparations itself, and it was done in the following way in Israel. So Israel would send an order to Germany and to their branch of the claims conference, and the claims conference would buy with the money from the German government physical things that were requested from German companies. So this included Volkswagen cars, farming equipment, mining equipment, and ships that built up the Israeli merchant fleet, mining that allowed mining the Timna Valley mines, and then farm equipment that allowed Israel to really increase its food production. So this was the sort of indirect system that didn't starve Germany of the economic growth and needed to keep making these payments, and in some ways may have helped the German economic miracle, as historical economists call it. And so that's the first one, reparations. So basically requests made for goods bought in Germany. And then the second is rehabilitation. So these are payments to older people mostly, but at the time to many people. And these were for things like elder care, apartments, doctor's visits, and later on care full-time from nurses. That's still made today. And then finally, we have restitution. And restitution is giving back either the actual item or the financial value of something that was physically taken, like property. Once Jews were taken to camps and their house was taken over. Keep in mind, this is in Germany, because in most of Europe, Jews were not allowed that property back. Art comes up very often when people die, and it turns out that their Nazi links mean they have an apartment in Vienna full of Klimts that belong to Jewish families. Stocks, insurance. Insurance was a very big deal in Switzerland, and banks that made a lot of money off the Holocaust and were not willing to disclose the amount to the recipients who would get it back. So those are basically the 3 ways. And you could describe all of this in terms of compensation, and reparations will really be goods that built Israel up. And what we mostly see today is the rehabilitation that continues to allow very old Holocaust survivors now to live out their final years in a much higher quality of life. So it's quite complicated what is actually in each part of it. And so this was so important for the growth of Israel. We basically saw the building of the port of Haifa, 45,000 jobs came in just the 12 years following it, and that's from the Bank of Israel. And that 15% of gross national product, which is how much a country makes, the 15% increase, which is gigantic. But the report qualified that Israel would have acquired these things regardless through loans and grants. But this didn't seem true in my research. So by the end of 1951, creditors and companies were not willing to extend credit to Israel anymore. That was not showing any economic growth. And then after these reparations came in, Israel just blossomed. So it became clear to me in my interviews that that might be something that was said to sort of appease people who were very much against receiving this. But you could even see it just in pictures from the time. Rationing, which was to a World War II extent, just was abolished by 1959. And people began to eat the way they do in Europe, and Israel began to look like this developed country instead of a developing country as it was. And the most important was just all these heavy industries, so combines, tractors, and diesel engines that allowed Israel to feed itself, to pay for the gas it needed to function, and to really develop. So this was so important.
I don't know if you have an answer to this, but there's kind of a saying there's a saying in the Jewish community that we don't like buying Volkswagens or BMWs because they're German cars. I know my grandmother personally, she worked in a slave labor camp for Volkswagen, and I'm curious how, if you have an answer for this, but how did Israelis feel about having Volkswagens and all of these heavy machinery building up their country that were like very well-known Nazi brands? If you have an answer to that.
Yeah, so it was of course mixed, like the answer to like everything. But so Dr. Moore told me about how his father-in-law was very excited to receive a Volkswagen because you have to understand the levels of deprivation this was not the Israel we know now, and it wasn't slumming it for a little while. This was a really desperate situation where you had to queue up for food like you did during some of the worst economic crises during the Great Depression. So this was really a time when a lot of people put those things aside. But of course, those sentiments remain and were very strong at the time from people like Menachem Begin, who couldn't have gotten the reparations anyway because he was not in Europe for when he would have qualified. But so that was a big problem where a lot of people were saying, you are against this, but you wouldn't get it anyway. But those attitudes continue today. And during the summer program, I was talked to by many people who would never go to Germany, had no interest, which is completely fine, of course. And we still mourn the Holocaust, and you do it in whatever way feels the way you can. I personally have lived in Germany for coming on 3 years because I just feel it's so different in the way they tackle the Holocaust and talk about it and acknowledge their sins of the past in the way that a lot of countries I've been to and known people from have not. So this is a completely valid opinion that at that time was very dependent on the person, the amount they were able to benefit from the reparations, and the amount they needed it. A lot of people needed it for their psychological counseling, for their health and well-being.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, my next question is for Kennedy. According to a 2018 Blue Card report, 1/3 of American, sorry, my bad. I think I wrote the wrong name. My next question is actually for Daniel. Can you give some examples about how different thinkers related to the Holocaust?
Yeah, so as I had mentioned before, there were a number of different ways, and it didn't always go based on denomination. There are some surprising responses from all denominations that seem to break, for lack of a better term, party lines. But just a few examples. I think one of the most interesting questions is how to deal with the covenantal aspect of the Holocaust, that if God made a covenant, the Jewish people will be his people, and that he would be there for them and that he's looking out for them. How could such atrocities have taken place? So you have extreme thinkers, you have some more extreme type of thinkers on the Orthodox right who think that specifically this was the covenant and the Jewish people were the ones who broke the covenant with their sins. And then you have thinkers on the reform level, as I mentioned earlier, Richard Rubinstein and Yitzhak Irving Greenberg, who think that the covenant was simply broken, that God clearly broke his covenant. So the question then, the response is possibly then, if the covenant's broken, we should respond in kind. That's on one level. Emil Fackenheim, I think, who was a professor of philosophy in Chicago for a little bit, but mostly at University of Toronto, there's actually some interesting work going out about him now. He had a fascinating response where he called it the 614th commandment, which I think really speaks to my education, that it's our duty now as Jews, after all that was lost in Europe, it's our duty, it's our responsibility to carry on the legacy of those who were killed. And that is what that reinvigorates and brings new life to the commandments and to the covenant. And the way that he speaks for a Reformed thinker, he's unbelievably orthodox, and possibly even the main sentiment that's given over in ultra-Orthodox communities. And then finally, one thinker who I think was a very interesting and nuanced approach is Dr. Eliezer Berkovitz, who is a professor of philosophy at Hebrew Theological College in Chicago for a number of years. And he has a whole approach of how God relates to man and how God's hiding his face shows God's presence and how the state of Israel can respond. And I think that in and of itself shows the depth of how broader philosophy can feed into this idea. But to get back on track for a second, I think that these examples, they shed light on the fact that you didn't have denominations that were responding. You didn't have groups of people who were totally indoctrinated. That the way that people lived their lives as Jews was brought into the fact that they were bothered by this question. They were bothered by what happened, and they responded in kind with taking this Jewish approach and asking why and seeing where that then puts us. And even if they came to vastly different results, I think that all of these thinkers, they did what you had mentioned, Isabella. They essentially confronted themselves and they asked the tough questions, and they were looking for, and unlike us, when we asked these questions in 4th and 5th grade, they asked them when they were, in their adult lives. And in their adult lives, they came up with sophisticated answers. And I think that the main message, if anything, is that we see that the questions that we have and the questions that we're bothered and plagued by were sought after and had responses by sophistication and by intelligent people.
Thanks so much. My next question is for Kennedy, and we're kind of going back into Christian Zionism. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. But the main question is, according to a 2019 poll by Median Opinion and Market Research, 1/3 of Hungarians hold anti-Semitic views. Your report speaks a lot about Hungary's and other Catholic-populated countries' support for Israel. To what extent are the leaders of these countries representative of the people's views on Jews in Israel? And how can we be so sure that their Catholicism or Christianity will ensure cooperation? And can you also just define a little bit more about what you mean by Christian Zionism? I know there might be a lot of confusion between evangelical Zionism and Christian Zionism, so I just love for you to get into that a little bit more.
Absolutely, I would love to. So what I mean about Christian Zionism is not this sort of supersessionism that I think a lot of Jews hear about. And if you don't interact with a lot of really practicing, believing Christians, you wouldn't know otherwise, right? So for example, I'm at a conference today with Passages, and when I walked in this morning, there was an hour-long fireside chat, and I didn't know this going in, but the entire chat was basically about, church history with anti-Semitism and how 2,000 years of church history on anti-Semitism, like we are the generation that is breaking this, like we are not evangelical Zionists. We are not supersessionists. This is what a real Christian Zionist looks like. This is a serious Christian approach to Israel, right? So what a Christian Zionist would say is that we believe that Jews are God's chosen people. We believe that God gave Jews the land of Israel. And so for like theological reasons, right, we are Zionists. I personally would consider myself a Christian and a Zionist. I think I'm a Zionist for other reasons, like different from my faith, but I think a lot of Christians would consider themselves Christian Zionists. And as for your question, I think why Christian Zionism in the US is so powerful is because it's not a top-down sort of phenomenon, right? Like this is ground up. Christians in the US are Zionists because they open their Bible and they see, wow, this is what God says about the people of Israel. You know, like the people of Israel are God's Jewish people, or are God's chosen people. I'm so sorry. I've had so many conversations, you know, with friends who grew up in evangelical or Baptist church in the South, and they'll go to Israel and they'll say, I always knew that I loved the land of Israel, that I loved the Jewish people. And I knew this because, you know, this is what God says in the Bible. So they really draw this from their scripture. And then when they go and really experience it for the first time, it sort of comes to life. So in the US, this is a huge driver of this sort of phenomenon drives politicians and not the other way around. And in Europe, I'm really trying to, you know, dig into the deep weeds of this too and see if the same is true for Europe. So I wrote a lot about Sebastian Kurz, for example, who actually is no longer the Chancellor of Germany. As I said, there are so many moving pieces in this research as of like a week ago. But actually, you know, the way that he speaks of it is really similar to Christian Zionism in the US, in the sense of like, I grew up in my home and my parents were practicing Catholics, and you know, this is how we read our Bibles, and this is what we learned about the Jewish people in the land of Israel from our Bibles. He also had very close relations with priests in Austria and throughout the continent, for example, priests that were very close, like were actually seen as potential successors to Pope Benedict XVI, I believe it is, before Pope Francis. I'm not Catholic, you can't tell, sorry. And so really there is so much going on. And then the last I would say about the anti-Semitic views, like how can these two things hold at once? That Hungary, for example, would be the country in Europe most speaking out on Israel's behalf, but also a third of the population is holding these anti-Semitic views. It's something that's very hard for me to grapple with, and I think for all people to grapple with at all, and with as well. And I think something that I would say is that in these parts of Europe, there's huge like this is sort of a post-Christian Europe, right? And we see remnants of this in the US, where it's like post-Christian sentiments that are sort of cloaked with crosses and other things. So like they profess themselves as Christians, but it's really not Christian at all. And you see this a lot in Hungary as well. And I think a lot of those anti-Semitic views on the far right in Hungary, for example, is they would call themselves Christians, but these are not like the real believing Christians, the ones that I'm talking about in the US who draw these beliefs from their Bible, for example. This is sort of like post-Christianity, but I'm not saying that there are not believing Christians in Hungary or other parts of Europe who also hold anti-Semitic views. And this is something that the church must tackle. And this is something that's very heartening for me. Like in Germany, for example, not only do they have a commissioner, a government commissioner for like the fight against anti-Semitism and Jewish life in Germany. And he's also a Christian, by the way, which is just extremely interesting, Dr. Felix Klein. But also they have instituted heads for the fight against anti-Semitism in all denominational churches in Germany. So I actually spoke with the commissioner in the fight against anti-Semitism in the evangelical church in Germany, and also in the Lutheran church in Germany. So this is so fascinating that it's happening. And these people recognize that, you know, some of their congregants hold these beliefs. And I think that the fact that this is sort of a ground up work and they're working within churches in collaboration with the government is, I think, you know, will hopefully lead to results, but it's also something that has been a huge challenge for me as I go about this research to make sure that these people, you know, we don't just want support for Israel, we want it for the right reasons. And that's something that I have been working within this research as well.
I love that. Yes, I know in the Jewish community, there's definitely a lot of confusion because can you explain a little bit more about kind of supersessionism and how the church has moved away from that?
Yeah.
Because I think it's something that a lot of Jews like myself need to hear, and we don't know a lot about.
Yes. Unfortunately, I should be way more articulate on this than I will be, because I work actually so in like these spaces. So basically, there are differing interpretations within different denominations for, centuries, millennia actually. And many would say prior to like late 20th century, the church held this supersessionist view that the covenant with the Jewish people no longer stood, that this covenant was overrun by the second covenant with the coming of the Messiah and the death on the cross and saving from our sins, right? So people who held this belief would say that Christians hold no sort of responsibility for anti-Semitism. Like actually the church was the main perpetrator of anti-Semitism for centuries, right? And now a lot of theologians and the majority of the Christians in the United States and elsewhere actually around the world, this is growing, read the Bible in an entirely different way. So for example, a really good book that I would plug, I guess, is called The New Christian Zionism. It was edited by Gerald McDermott, who is a leading theologian who fights against the supersessionist view and, furthers these other ideas of that God still holds his covenant with the Jewish people, for example. It's a really interesting book with chapters written by a lot of reputable Christian scholars. I think it was published in 2016. So that would be the supersessionist view, which a lot of Christians held until like the late 20th century, for an example. But now in the US, all I have ever known really in people of my generation, I'm not saying there's outlier churches, and especially with the invention of Passages and the Felix Project, these organizations that engage Christians with the Jewish roots of their faith and with the land of Israel. It's something that it's a really new phenomenon. And I understand why, Jews who don't grow up around Christians, who they just read about Christians in the news, also people are really bad about reporting about Christians. Like no one really knows how to talk about evangelicals, for example. You see why you would believe the other way, but yes, I would say that the main belief today is that supersessionism no longer holds, that the first covenant still stands, so that the Jews are God's chosen people, and that Christians, because the church was the main perpetrator of anti-Semitism for centuries, have an extra burden to fight anti-Semitism today and stand in solidarity with Jews in your community and with the land of Israel.
Thank you so much. That was a very fantastic answer. Oh, Maya, I love your cat. Yes, I'm definitely going to look into more about Passages because I have some Christian friends who have been begging to come visit me in Israel, but they can't exactly do birthright, so I will look into that for them.
Please, I would love to give you more information as well.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. That just about wraps it up. Blake, do you have anything to say? Thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate you guys talking about your really cool projects. And I'll let Blake close it up if he can.
Yeah, so hi everyone. This might be the voice of God coming to you because I don't know if you can see me on the webinar, but thank you so much to our panelists today, and thank you so much to the Tikvah Fund for educating the next generation of leaders, of thought leaders, and people who can understand and can synthesize so much about the Jewish people, Jewish history, and Jewish culture. It really is amazing and very much needed in this day and age. And if you would like to see and hear more events like this one, make sure to follow New Zionist Congress on social media, at New Zionist Congress on Instagram, at New Zionists on Twitter, and make sure to join us at newzionists.org to get our Sunday newsletter, where we you're the first to know about all of our events coming up. And there are very exciting events coming up, and we can't wait to see you at many of them. So thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Kennedy. Thank you, Daniel. And Shavua Tov, everyone. Have a great week.
Shavua Tov. Thank you guys so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.